Welcome, everyone. It is a bit strange to be in this room with so few people. Last year we were sitting in the aisles, but it's great to actually be able to be here together at all, and welcome. My name's Catherine Munaji, and I'm the Artistic Director of the festival. I'm just briefly going to introduce our two speakers today. Note the glove, so I will hand back a sanitized microphone. One has to be very careful. We're doing our best. Today we have, sorry, I'm juggling two books here. We're going to find out more about what we don't know or what people know about us that we might prefer them not to. And I mean, more complicatedly than that. Brian Toohey has written this very interesting and revealing book called The Making of Australia's Security State. And I think I think they're things we all need to know. He's going to be interviewed by journalist Hamish McDonald, who's also written a book which has the same name as another book in this festival. It's called Reasonable But Doubt. But this one is about the Croatian Six, the miscarriage of justice that took place in Sydney in the late 70s, 79. So this book will be available for sale as well. So please enjoy yourselves, if that's the right way of putting it. When you want to ask questions, you'll just have to stand up and use sort of big voices, because we'd rather not we'd have to sanitize the microphone, so it's just going to get a bit complicated. Thank you very much, and I'll leave you to enjoy your session.
Good. Well, thank you for coming here, and it's a privilege for me to be interviewing Brian, whom I've known for more years than I care to remember, certainly since the days in the early 70s in the Press Gallery in Canberra. As you probably know, he's gone on to be the preeminent explorer and commentator on intelligence and security matters in Australia. He's broken numerous stories about the ramifications of the US alliance and the intrigues of our defence and security masters in Canberra. He's had the federal police on his case many times in search of leaks. In fact, one of his earlier books was called The Book of Leaks, which broke a lot of fascinating material and really informed us about what's going on. Brian worked in Washington for the Financial Review, and then back in Australia for many, many years, commenting not just on security matters, but on economic structures and so on. Very wide-ranging, incisive intellect. So I'm very happy to do this job. Now, as this is a crime festival, I thought I'd kick off by asking Brian, to what extent do our intelligence services use criminal methods?
To a very, very large extent, far more than a normal crime writer could think the police would ever be doing. They're allowed to assault people, they're allowed to bug both rooms and phones, etc. They're allowed to eavesdrop, steal computer hard drives, can do bribery, and most contentiously of all, they investigate attempts for one person to influence another. And that is now a crime, which I think is just appalling. In a democracy, people should be allowed to influence other people without it being a crime, with a potential jail sentence of 10 years. And the other thing that's not strictly, well, it is, it's the security forces. If you include the defence forces, then there is plausible, or there is seemingly, after a big inquiry, belated inquiry, it appears to be that there are serious alleged war crimes being committed by special forces, both commandos and the SAS. And how you make a hero, in the past, most writers in that area had their heroes as SAS people, etc. Now I don't know what they're going to do.
So our spies who go out, mainly from the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, the human intelligence side of things, they would be going out employing what were the 3 or maybe 4 Bs of espionage. So bribery, blackmail, burglary, and bugging. That would be what they do, is it?
Yes, and what they do is every day they're on the job, they are breaking the law. And this was put very, very clearly by a former Justice of the Supreme Court in New South Wales, Bob Hope, who said in his inquiry, he was very tough on ASIO in his inquiry, which was set up by Whitlam into the intelligence services. He, when it came to ASIO, he became all starry-eyed and said, "Look, the job of this services is to break the law and to do so more aggressively." I rather thought, hang on, how do we get here? And the big thing is that because they are breaking the law, you'll find people, particularly senior people in ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, not being very keen on the idea that the other service, the Australian Security Intelligence Service, should be going around arresting people committing crimes called espionage. That's the last thing. If they are doing the same thing overseas as we are giving huge amounts of money to ASIO now to try and find people breaching those laws.
Right. And we don't use honey traps, do we, like some other intelligence services?
Well, not in your experience, Hamish, but I think I've no idea whether or not some of them try to do that overseas or here in terms of trying to infiltrate. I think it'd just be too dangerous for the honey person to be trying to be uncover someone who's a terrorist here or something. Overseas, they might do that. I don't know, and I don't think they would, and there's certainly no need for them to do so.
But wasn't one of the trainees in the Sheraton incident advised to wear some sexy underwear?
I think she was preparing for that sort of instance, but she loved everything about it. But she missed this. I can talk briefly about it. This crime that was committed by the newly restored covert action section of the ASIS at the Sheraton Hotel. But she explained her instructor had told her because she might be deployed overseas and get caught, to be wearing sexy underwear, or no, it was mostly, I think, French-made underwear, Italian bra, British shoes or something, so that they wouldn't know when she was arrested and stripped or whatever, where she came from. Well, I thought that maybe her Australian accent might give her away, but the other thing she loved doing, and she made a big point about this, she loves strapping her personal weapon, a Walther PKK, to her thigh. I think a spy writer might be able to embellish that slightly to the inside of the thigh, but nonetheless, she was the last sort of person who should be doing this. She was just so eager to get involved in it all. And also, it is absolutely stupid for ASIS to be running around doing this sort of stuff, because the key role, as a previous head of ASIS pointed out, was to get information out of people, and that requires subtlety, building a relationship, recruiting an agent and getting them to give over information. You don't do that by prancing around with them, waving a gun around. And the people who like playing with guns are the wrong sort of people to recruit.
Before we leave that subject, have any foreign services successfully used honey traps against our politicians or officials?
I hadn't. I'm not sure. I've got in the book that someone who was certainly an undercover CIA official in Canberra was having an affair with someone who had been a senior minister in the Labor government in the 1980s. I said I didn't know whether it was for sort of recreational purposes or work purposes or a bit of both. But certainly that would have been a chance. But if they look, of course, they'd have no compunction about using it if they thought it would work. By the way, I just mentioned there that all of the official history of ASIO and all that. There's never been any undercover CIA people in Australia, never. Well, some of the people who worked very senior in the CIA said, look, you'd have about 30 undercover people there at any one time, and they just refused to acknowledge it. That's why I wrote about that particular woman, because she was definitely undercover here.
Okay. And what about murder? Do we go in for assassinations?
Very early on, when ASIS was first formed and had hardly any people in the 1950s, someone who worked on the Defence Committee told me that they had to keep knocking back requests to assassinate people. I don't believe the people working for ASIS at the time would have been trained in any way for doing that. There was hardly any of them. They would have needed defence people to do it, special forces people or whatever. And so that's, I guess, why they needed the permission of the Defence Committee, and they always knocked them back. And this guy said it was just incessant. They just wanted to, well, the head of it wanted to assassinate someone. And he got the sack in the end, but not for that.
Right. But we seem to be helping some of our allies carry out targeted killings.
We do this through the famous Five Eyes thing, which no one took much notice of for a long while. Now, journalists wet their pants at the mere mention that we're part of the Five Eyes arrangement. I think it's a very outdated thing. It's an old Anglo-Saxon or Anglophile organisation involving primarily the US, Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And it's ill-suited for where we are in the world. And it was originally set up to handle signals intelligence. That's the interception, which the NSA is the biggest at, but GCHQ, the British equivalent, was also pretty big. And then we've got what is now called ASD, the Australian Signals Directorate, but for many years it was called Defence Signals Directorate. New Zealand's got some NSA bases there. I don't think it's got anyone doing this stuff. In Canada, I forget about. So through that now, or through other things, yes, all the time, if they say here, oh, we would never intercept anything involving an Australian person, what that doesn't mean that they can't get the British to do it or the Americans to do it for them, and likewise the Americans to do it for us if we wanted them to, or we certainly do it for them. And one of the things people keep pointing out, oh, and they're not allowed to do this, they're not allowed to. Well, there's a thing in my book where there's a memo which leaked to, which he took with him actually, is Edward Snowden, one of the most spectacular leaks of all time. He's got a document there where they're proposing that they intercept anything they like involving members of their allies, and either with permission or without first asking or not asking, either way, And it makes sense that look who runs these American organisations. The current head of the State Department, I should say, Pompey. He just willingly lies. He'd do anything at all, and he got this job after being head of the CIA. They will do anything.
And going back to the targeted killings, we help that, do we?
Well, we'd only help, I think, in the way of providing signals intelligence. By providing signals intelligence to the target. I mean, one example of where that happens is the use of drones or special forces to kill someone they suspect to be a terrorist, not just some general range of people they don't know, but what they end up doing is killing lots of innocent civilians. There was one drone strike where they killed 1,100 people because they kept putting in missiles down on these people were in a jeep or something, and then people rushed out to help them. They thought they must have been terrorists first, and they kill an enormous number of people. Now, the data for that is collected from two sites. One is Pine Gap through its overhead satellites, and the other is from Memworth Hill in Britain, and they have the same sort of satellites. So there's about 8 of them strung across this huge the equator, and they can be used to detect mainly signals, sort of phone calls, that sort of thing, from the suspected terrorists, and then they can zoom in on, put the drones in, and then the drones fire missiles, or put special forces in. So yes, we are definitely helping unlawful killings. I mean, this is extrajudicial execution. There's no other way around it.
So when spies go out and do all these illegal things, I guess the unwritten rule is don't get caught, and yet they've been caught red-handed in Delhi 2004, bugging the Timor-Leste government officers during the oil negotiations.
Just before I answer that, Hamish, can I answer one involving ASIO? A New South Wales Supreme Court judge found that 2 ASIO officials had kidnapped someone, and what did they do? They changed the law to make it a law that in future an ASIO and all the related intelligence services during a special intelligence office could do anything they liked, including kidnap, except murder. Now, but you won't allow, if you had a massive sentence if you were a journalist and you wrote up what clearly would be an abuse of power in some way or other, and if you tried to say, look, I don't want to commit a crime, I'll ring ASIO to see if this is a special intelligence operation, and ASIO is not allowed to tell you. At least when a bank robber robs a bank, he knows he's committing a crime. So now moving on to what I think is probably the most damaging use of our intelligence services that I can think of, and that's the bugging of the Cabinet Office in Delhi just by a squad of people from the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. They were not officers posted overseas to spy on people. They were doing, a technician heading it was now called Officer K. He was there to send these signals back still in Delhi to a boat offshore, and then it went on to help this was set up first up or approved by Downer, and then it went to Woodside Petroleum, and the key that they were looking for was to intercept what was happening in the cabinet room about the position of the East Timorese on the offshore resources boundaries, and they used that to let this tiny little impoverished country be cheated on its share of the revenue from gases, and the money was given primarily to Woodside, and there was another company because there was another thing that was worth a lot of money that was also produced from those wells. Now, this was supposed to be wonderful, clever, hard-nosed work on the part of the ACES. It had nothing whatsoever to do with national security, and everything was helping a particular multinational company make more money. But they went on their neck because they'd already, as Hamish is first, I think, to report this, they'd also introduced legislation which stopped or made it no longer could Australia be subjected to international tribunals looking at breaches of the law of the sea, which the resource things come under, offshore oil, and that comes under that. So they thought they were going to escape, but they were too clever by half, because the witness K thought this was immoral once he realised that Downer was working as a consultant when he left for Woodside and the head of the Foreign Affairs Department. He was on the board, and so this is all legal. He wanted to make an internal complaint, and the Inspector General of Intelligence Services said, "Well, take it to a lawyer. Go to a lawyer." And he went to a lawyer in Canberra who was Colery, and both of them are now charged with offences under the Intelligence Services Act and face severe jail sentences for doing what I think anyone would have to admit was a very, very proper thing, reporting absolutely it's legal behaviour and morally wrong behaviour by the Australian government. And they now are facing serious sentences in a trial that is being held largely in secret. Now, one of the things the government likes to talk about is the rule of law is so important. Well, one of the things that's important to the rule of law is you don't have secret trials. Earlier, they had one a couple of years earlier from someone, they had one in Canberra where the Canberra government wasn't told. No one was told about it until after someone had been jailed who I think worked for ASIS, and that wasn't known. We didn't know what the charges were. We didn't know who the person was. All we know now is that this trial happened, but no one knew at the time.
Right. There's quite an interesting series of interviews that's being put up on the website of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which, as you probably all know, is the local branch of the American military-industrial complex. It's an interview by Graham DeBell with Paul Simon, who's the current head of ASIS. And the second one went up last Sunday. I think the third is tomorrow, and the last one next Sunday. But in the second instalment, Paul Simon says that all the risks of what he calls disruptive operations overseas are carefully assessed and balanced before they decide to go, and that nobody is going to be foolhardy. He also said that any such operation would have to be approved by the foreign minister, who is the minister responsible for ASIS, and then would be cleared with the prime minister. So can we assume that this Dili operation would have been approved by Alexander Downer and by John Howard?
Well, certainly by Downer. He's boasted about doing it. And I think Howard certainly would. I think a number of Labor prime ministers would have done so too, in not Whitlam's era or whatever. But and I find this very odd. Before, when Downer had earlier let ASIS be armed on the most spurious of grounds, that in case they were in a meeting with CIA people who were armed and wanted to do an armed operation, so that just having it discussed, that would mean they'd have to have arms on them, or use arms, or have them be issued to them. This is trying to argue that it's a smaller sort of thing, but what are the disruptive operations that they're doing? The job of ASIS, if it's to have any legitimate job, is to gather information. And whether or not it's worthwhile is a different thing. I know people who have read this stuff and say it's just trash, it's just gossip coming back. Others seem to love getting hold of it. But three examples. Malcolm Fraser, after he stopped being the Prime Minister. Gareth Evans, after he'd stopped being Foreign Minister and Attorney General and trying to put me in jail. And after another guy who worked for a very long while as very senior in Deputy Head of Defence and the Head of ASIO, they all said that nothing they read from the intelligence services had any worth whatsoever for policy or use whatsoever. And and the difference there is, in the end, these people have to have a fairly hard-headed analysis of what's being produced for themselves. They can't just be a staff member chortling about how, they worked out who's. I think they used to love reporting how Prabowo, this is the general, in Indonesia, that the head of the company that was absolutely wrecking parts of West Papua, I should say, and that used to be called.
Freeport.
Freeport, it's based in New Orleans, and that his wife, the head of Bebob was his name, the head of the Freeport thing, was having it off with one of the daughters of Suharto, and that caused much for the interest back here, but it was nil importance to anything, basically.
Yeah, well, I guess in probably the smartest thing Billy McMahon ever said, he said he found the ASIS reporting was mostly barroom gossip.
Yeah.
But have there been any actual coups by ASIS?
In information, not that I'm aware of. I know Hope picked out two, which won't. He called them two gems, and both involved Indonesia. One was that they found out the what was happening in the boundary of the Indonesian position in boundary discussions over there. This is a very long line of where Australia's resource boundary ended offshore and the Indonesian one. And we came out of that on top. There's a dispute as to whether or not that information was very good. But again, it was the use of ACES to do something very nasty to a neighbour of ours, and I would say immoral, because the law now is that you have to have that line, the midpoint. It's we jump up and down about these things in relation to China and the South China Sea. We have willingly broken these laws and tried to cover them up. The other thing that he claimed was a great success was they got blueprints or something for the MiG-15 fighter plane. Well, the Americans got hold of those when those planes were shot down during the Korean War, and they could re-engineer them and all that sort of stuff. So I've never heard of anything that's important. They had the biggest deployment of ACES overseas ever has been Afghanistan, at least 12 people there. And you might have noticed that the ABC, in a very, very good series, on air, it wasn't put to air, and it wasn't put to on television, because the ABC bosses were terrified about what would happen and how much the Defence Force heads would get upset. Well, they weren't upset in the slightest. And this was mainly about the war crimes there, but it was also about a young woman. They were in Kabul, the ISIS people, and they were guarded, even though they were armed themselves. They were guarded by an SAS contingent. And over drinks one night there, the SAS guy was waving his bloody pistol around in the direction of this particular woman who he was trying to crack onto, who worked for ISIS. And that's, but I can't understand what on earth they were doing there. I asked someone who was supposed to know, and he said, they're just passing on intelligence from the Americans. Well, they could pass them on to the SAS and that without the need for anyone from ISIS. More to the point, the intelligence was in many, many cases, completely wrong. And that's what really screwed all the foreign forces in Afghanistan. They kept killing people who were not on the side of the Taliban. And needless to say, that's no way to win a war.
Brian, can we get on to the security state? Can you tell us some of the dimensions of what is happening with the expansion of the domestic security apparatus?
Well, people probably don't know this, but Bob Menzies was my hero in this area. He wasn't always good, like banning the Communist Party, but he didn't do anything about or anything much about having any espionage laws. His Attorney General brought in a draft espionage law and he threw it out in its entirety because it was too interfering with the rights of Australians. And then you go right on through the Whitlam and the Fraser years, and that nothing much happened. You get to the Hawke, and there a really bad thing happened. Is Hawke made it, you could not report the name of an ASIO official. Previously you could. And that was the first thing that really opened up there becoming, in effect, a sort of secret police. And the next step was under Howard, when it became a criminal offence to actually report anything that they did, so that you couldn't report their names and you couldn't report what they were doing, basically. And that's just the recipe for a secret police in this country. No one seems to care, but likewise, some of the things that have happened is that they've been given executive powers of government. In the past, ASIO couldn't do anything. They couldn't interview you if you didn't want to be interviewed. They certainly couldn't detain you. Now there are laws that let ASIO detain people. And initially, the idea was that they couldn't even let their family know where they were. But now they have to, after a certain time, do that. And also, these days, you can have a lawyer present, but if the lawyer asks any questions they don't like, they get thrown out. So, and you get 5 years jail for not answering a question, and you get 5 years jail reporting that this happened. Now, one of the classic things that they would be asked to do in this area is to, on behalf of, say, the Americans, to find out where someone was living, that someone who was say a cousin of a terrorist, they might want, who say lived in Spain. Sorry, but he said, sorry, the so-called terrorist might have lived in Spain, but the person lived in Australia. So he could go in there and demand to hand over the whereabouts of this guy. And if he refused, he would cop 5 years jail. I think he had every right to refuse, because what that information's been handed over for is extrajudicial execution, and that no one should be made to do that. And there's now the laws. Sorry, I'll just give the things about some of the new laws. Sorry, not going on a bit here, but ever since Howard got in September, Howard did nothing initially, but once September 11, there's been now 83 terrorism laws previously there was never any special terrorism laws. It was treated as a murder, which is what it is, and no laws were regarded as necessary. Malcolm Fraser, when he was Prime Minister, he had a meeting of the Commonwealth heads of government at the Hilton Hotel in Sydney, and there's a bomb went off which killed 3 people, 2 garbage men, a policeman, and injured 11 others. And what did he do? Did he say, look, I know what I'll do, is I'll introduce special terrorism legislation and I'll try and wedge Labor on this? He said, leave it to the police and the normal court action. So, but beyond that, there's now a whole lot of things to which there is no defence. They have passed laws where it's, I just have to flip this up, sorry. For example, it is a law to write anything or report anything that does intangible harm to relations with another country. Now, how on earth do you know whether you're doing intangible harm or not? And other things they do say that it's anything, any information of any sort, it doesn't have to be classified, that can be a crime if it causes harm. Well, and anyone who receives it, anyone who leaks it or anyone who receives it. And of course, and there's quite a few more of these where they're very, very slack in terms of the definition is so wide that anything can be an offence. I keep moving this. And one of the worst ones, I think, is that I mentioned before, is this new law against influence, trying to influence other people. Now, the papers are reporting the latest, the first and only ever example they've done of this, that they arrested someone in Melbourne. And the headline's all about for being a spy. Well, that's not being a spy. A spy is when you try to obtain information from the government of the country where you're in or whatever. This one is doing what anyone should be allowed to do in a democracy, and that's try to influence someone else. But what they've done now is take it for granted that these Chinese are so devilish and so clever that the second they did anything to influence you, you would succumb, you'd fall over and you'd say, what else what else would you like to influence me on? And this is at a time when the Chinese, the reputation of China in Australia is down to 22%, I think. There is no chance on earth that anyone in a senior level in politics or in the public service or in the military or whatever would become an agent of influence for the Chinese. And the head of ASIO, the last head of ASIO, said that Australians could wake up one morning and find that the country had actually been taken over by these Chinese agents of influence, which the Australian obligingly wrote up as Manchurian candidates. So I mean, it's just nutcase stuff, serious nutcase stuff. And here's the head of ASIO being written up adoringly by Australian journalists for saying this. And I noticed that a Liberal Party, a woman called Gladys Yu, won a seat for the Liberal Party in Victoria at the last election. And I thought, that name's a clue. She must be one of those Manchurian candidates. But I then recalled the novel, and the difference between the novel and the movie is that I couldn't work out what her role was. Was it to kill the Prime Minister or to become the Prime Minister? And I just still don't know to this day, because she doesn't seem to have done anything since entering Parliament. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I guess in the 1940s it might have been attractive to a lot of people to think that the Soviet system was the way of the future and the answer to the ills of capitalism that we'd seen in the 30s. But now, do you see anyone saying, "Oh, yes, we need to copy China"?
Well, I certainly don't see anyone would. I mean, what does it mean to become? What the head of ASIO was talking about was taking over the Australian government. Just absolute nonsense. And I can't see how they can have any influence at all. And if they did, it wouldn't matter very much. I mean, in the case of the 1950s, members of the Australian Communist Party, which fortunately was not banned, that was one of the terrible things Menzies did try to do, and one of the great things that a Labor opposition leader, they'd be so cowed and frightened now. I've heard ministers now, Labor shadow ministers, saying, "Oh yes, we've been briefed by ASIO too. We always keep secret what they tell us. Oh yes, the woman who heads up the opposition here, Labor opposition in New South Wales. The second this thing was done about a member of the upper house, he was not suspected to be an agent or succumbing to an agent of influence, but she got out there, and this is dreadful, terrible news, he must be sacked immediately, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the thing in the 50s was that people were members of the Communist Party, and some of them also were great admirers of the Russian Communist Party, and others were great admirers of the Chinese Communist Party, and but it didn't matter. I mean, the people who were in the Communist Party of Australia lost interest. They wound up the party not so long, a fair while ago. And likewise, during the Vietnam War, many people would have, I think, found it quite reasonable to be supportive of the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh, etc., and the and the Vietnamese Communist Party. These days, you've got to absolutely admire the Vietnamese Communist Party because they're on the side of the West and the Americans against China. One of the things that was so obvious from the beginning, and again, a marvellous speech written by Graham Freudenberg for the then Labor Party opposition leader, Arthur Calwell, which predicted right at the beginning, when there was a battalion of troops was initially sent in 1965 by Menzies to Vietnam. That was all based truly on the whole idea of the domino theory that Vietnam was just a puppet of China, and this was the Chinese way of trying to take over Australia, basically. And he absolutely blew this out of the water. That was the official American advice too, and the intelligence advice. There was just a puppet of China and so on. And just said that is not true. There's a long animosity between Vietnam and China, and that he predicted actually that we would end up there with 7,000 troops, which we did. But one of the things I like about back then is in 1969, remember the war kept going until 1975, the defence minister back then, Alan Fairhall, stood up in Parliament and said, "Look, I'm cutting the defence budget by 5% because there's no threat whatsoever from Vietnam. The war was still raging. We still had 7,000 troops there, but we don't need any of that really. So I'm cutting the budget by 5%. And he was right that certainly Vietnam was no threat. Now we've gone back. That's called the forward defence policy we were trying to do then by going to war up there. Now we're back to putting submarines in the right up top end of the South China Sea to try and basically stop or block any Chinese submarines from getting out. They're in a very invidious position. There's a whole lot of underwater choke points, and the Americans and the Japanese, with us along some minor role, have laid all of these acoustic arrays on the seabed. And so they're supposed to know where they are at all times and so forth. But what they want to do there, which is incredibly dangerous, is what the Americans want to do is the Chinese have got two nuclear-armed ballistic missile-carrying submarines, and they want to sink them so that they're the ones to do retaliation if the Americans do a first strike. And someone said, well, the Americans will never do a first strike. Well, they did it in 1945, and they have never disavowed it. And if you look at my book, the person who did it in 1945 was writing these lists out to himself, saying, this is Harry Truman, and now look, I'd like to bomb on these things in Russia, a long list of things, and these things in China. And then I'll give them the ultimatum. You're a surrender now, or I'll do this. And the current, in terms of the current regime in America, the Bolton, who got sacked by Trump, never seemed to take any notice of what these people, what their background was. He was the uber hawk amongst all the uber hawks in America, who wanted to absolutely in favour of using nuclear weapons. But when Trump sacked him, he said, all he wanted to do was drop bombs on people. And I thought, I got rid of him. But,
okay, just on the security state, who is the intellectual mastermind behind this? It can't be Peter Dutton, the ex-Queensland police constable. So where is it coming from?
What a snob you are. Well, why not? Yes. I was more interested in how he owns about 70 properties or something or other after being a constable in the Queensland Police Force. But it's obviously the head of Home Affairs, who's called Mike. This is, I should explain what Home Affairs does. It has gathered together all of these agencies which used to be in different things. Mike! So it didn't exist before, but it's now got ASIO and AFP and a whole lot of crime intelligence bureaus and so forth there, and then a huge array of other things that you can't possibly imagine why they're in this same thing. And this is, and it's headed by someone who used to be the deputy head of defence. He went across to head immigration. Now that's one thing that's built around that one thing is all of these other things, and which Mike Pizzullo, is absolutely runs. And if no one thinks he doesn't run at all, and he says, of course, they're up ASIO and federal police and all of that, it's up to them what they want to do. He's very keen on using the Australian Signals Intelligence Agency to intercept signals involving phone lines, emails, whatever, chat room stuff and so on, to catch domestic criminals. He always puts first pedophiles because he knows people don't like them much, then serious crime, on terrorism, and then serious crime. And in the case of serious crime, it goes on how long a potential sentence you can get. But sometimes these crimes are things where magistrates do a sentence without actually sending one off to jail. It's very minor crime. And so he wanted to get this law, and he wrote a letter to the head of the Defence Department saying he wanted to do this and attaching it. And that's what the journalist from the Telegraph News Limited got caught for publishing. Sorry, I shouldn't say get caught for. They wanted to prosecute her for providing that information. Now, that information was just that he wanted to do this. Now, if they were going ahead with it, of course it would have had to become public. We still in this country have to bring in laws to allow things that go to Parliament. And in this case, what happened, what astonished me, is he wanted to use the Australian defence signals, and they said no, because with very rare exceptions, they reckon that their reputation is based on not doing this sort of stuff to Australian citizens. So, but what happened is Pizzullo got around this by getting the federal police to do it. And I can't see how they can do it on their own. They have to have help from ASD to do it. But that had nothing to do with him, theoretically. And
good. Yeah, and I believe the warrant for that search came from the registrar at the Queanbeyan local courts. This is high-level judicial supervision.
Well, here is a major problem and he spelled it out in a way where he was just absolutely contemptuous, despite saying how there should be legal constraints. He keeps saying, oh, everything must be done in accordance with the law and that. And so when he was the one who pushed this new legislation to let, in effect, or to force companies in Australia, tech companies and that, to let them build backdoors, and they don't like that word, but it's the same thing, so that they can get hold of stuff before it's encrypted, as you know, going in there. You can't always do that, but that's their goal. And so one part of it, something like 12 different intelligence agencies and police forces were allowed to present them with a notification that they had to provide assistance. No warrant whatsoever. The other was supposed to be the really tough thing where you force them to build backdoors into their own systems, which over time will weaken the system. And in the case of America, this has happened with the NSA, where things have leaked out of there, and then all of that malware that it's called that is floating around the world in the hands of criminals, and they're offering doing blackmail that they'll shut down your computers and only open them in a hospital, etc., if you pay them. Now, in this case, what happened was, before a parliamentary committee, he was asked about, what about judicial oversight? He said, look, just suppose for a moment that we wanted to make someone give oversight on this. We could get someone to sprinkle some magic dust, do a few incantations, and suddenly you've got proper oversight there by the Attorney General of Australia. That's what he thought of the Attorney General. If you want to have due process about issuing these sort of warrants, it must be issued by a court, and a senior court. You cannot have an Attorney General who's a member of a government. That's not an objective, independent person, as we can see in the court case. As we can see in the court case involving witness K, etc.
Okay, Brian, thank you. I think we've got time now for a few questions. If anyone wants to ask anything, please speak up, because it's some of you are quite far away from us.
Brian, why do you think Australians aren't interested in all of these laws having been passed and the states sort of creeping up in this way?
The question is, why aren't Australians interested in these laws and the way these restrictions are creeping up on us?
Well, I think in two levels. Early on, they were all sold as terrorism. Some of the terrorism laws go way beyond anything to do with terrorism. And now, of course, there's this terrible fear of China. I think absolutely misplaced. There is no way on earth that China has any motive to try and invade Australia while we continue to sell them things that they want, etc. But I think all of these laws are great because they're aimed at China, and the espionage and the whole of the influence laws and all of that. Now, I think the other core thing is that they think it's not going to happen to me or my friends, so I don't care. I really think that's a very, very big thing. So what's not deep-rooted here is the whole idea of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus went out the window with that one about detention, where the ASIO can detain you. That's not you can be detained without any trial, anything like that. So people don't care about any of this, as far as I can see, and I don't know when that's going to change. But let's not have too many sermons from ministers about we believe in the rule of law and freedom and all this crap. They don't. Do people hear that?
Is there a role for terrorism laws in any way at all?
I can't see any because it's murder. And what happened between 1966 and September 2001, there had been something like 161 instances of what would be defined as terrorism, politically motivated violence in Australia. Often people were getting killed. A lot of people were getting killed or injured. And I gave you the case of the Hilton, where 3 people were killed and 11 injured. Fraser saw no need to bring in terrorism laws, none. And So I don't think there is any. Maybe there's a few more things you had to tweak a bit about the powers to intercept this phone call or that phone call or whatever. But the law of these murder is enough. And look, some of the people in the intelligence agencies, also in Britain in particular, two different people who headed up MI5, they really hated the idea of the war on terror. They said this is just the Americans, wanting this. They should never use this language. It in some ways glamorises the people within their own communities who commit these terrorist acts. Otherwise, if they were just called murderers, that would not give them much kudos.
Up the back there.
Sorry.
There was a case of UNSW a couple of years ago where a young man fabricated an incriminating diary of another foreign student who was immediately arrested and taken off by ASIO. He's won substantial damages, and the guy who fabricated the case has just got 2.5 years jail for that. He asked your thoughts about that.
Well, the thing is, they should have had a thorough investigation in the first place. And the motive, the guy making this up had a motive. He didn't like the other guy. Simple as that. And he thought he'd frame him for this. And before that happened, there should have been a proper investigation, except grabbing at the buddy. Thought he was accused of terrorism. You'd think you'd have a bit of a thorough look before you went down that track.
Would Australian history be significantly different if we'd never had any of these security or intelligence agencies?
Would Australian history be any different if we never had any of these intelligence and security agencies?
I don't think it would be much different. We'd save a lot of money. We'd have wouldn't need for innocent people to be going to jail or potentially going to jail, as now happening in the court case in Canberra. We've got to look at ASIO. We have never caught a foreign spy in Australia, and all the time it's been going. I mean, this guy, and certainly, convicted. The only important foreign agent here, I think, in Australian history, he got off scot-free, and that was Ernest Titterton, the man, a British citizen, who worked on the British atomic energy program, and Menzies was stupid enough to make him head of the Australian Safety Board for these tests. He was more gung-ho for the test than many of the people actually working in the British atomic energy or atomic weapons establishment. And the finding of a very, very good Royal Commission, which happened quickly and produced tough stuff, which was from Diamond Jim McClelland, he had been a judge and a Labor Party minister at one stage. And he said that Titterton had been a member of the British team the entire time and did not consider, in contrast or in conflict, the interest of Australians in terms of safety. Don't forget that a lot of people were exposed to radiation back then from the above ground tests, and a lot more were exposed to something that was so secret. No Australian scientists or anyone else knew about this. The Titterton just took on his own. He's not an Australian. He worked in physics at the ANU, but was never an Australian citizen. He said, no, there was no problem about safety. They were unbelievably safe because they shattered plutonium into very, very fine particles, which blew all around the desert, around Paralinga, and people, like particularly Aboriginals and that, going through, and kids playing in the dust. And when they first tried to clean up that area, they used bulldozers to get rid of the topsoil and the sand. And of course, that just spread the dust even further. So he's the only one I can think of that has been a foreign agent of any sort of damage. And of course, ASIO, of course, should have put him in jail for years and so forth, but didn't. during World War II, remember that there was a lot of fuss made about the nest of spies, as the foreign minister at one stage said, in the external affairs, it was called, department under Evatt during World War II. And the only thing of any substance, seeming substance, that was sent back was a very enterprising, very hard-working member of the Communist Party who collected this stuff, gave it to some from TASS, and gave it to the KGB guy in the embassy. KGB guy had never met the guy who was getting all this stuff, but he kept getting things back from Moscow saying, for Christ's sake, stop sending us all this rubbish. We have to bloody decode it, by hand. Get permission, before you even collect anything, including permission to these two British documents, the big thing that was supposed to be a problem about sending to Moscow was two British documents which were written by a post-war planning organisation in Britain, for cabinet office thing. And the person who wrote the first volume of Asia History said, this would have been of tremendous value to the Soviet Union. It would have been of no value to the Soviet Union because the lazy bastard never bothered to look what was in those documents. And what was in those documents, which you can get them, I got it with the help of a young researcher in the ANU, in the British archives. And when you read them, one was about what Britain's policy was towards the Mediterranean after the war. Well, they wanted to have continuing influence, end of that debate. The other one was about India. They did not know that they saw India still being part of being a British possession in 1956. And of course, that all ended in 1947. They said it was very, very important that there be no internal violence in India. Well, the 1947 and the partition of India caused the first Indian and Pakistani war, and so it went on. They got every single prediction wrong about India, and obviously even things like stability, or why the Russians couldn't go berserk in the Mediterranean, was nuclear weapons were invented. Now, at that stage, Britain was working on nuclear weapons, but clearly no one was told on this committee about it. Speak up.
Question is, what can we do as concerned citizens to push back against this security state?
Well, I think you should try to convince Labor politicians to be a lot stronger in favour of the civil liberties and that sort of thing which are being breached here. And I mean, Evatt did a wonderful job in that regard against the Menzies bill to make the Communist Party illegal. There was a time when many members of the Liberal Party were like that, and certainly Malcolm Turnbull claimed that he was like that, but once he was Prime Minister, he brought in some of the worst examples of these new laws. I am pessimistic about this. I think while this propaganda campaign against China keeps running, and it's running very hard with lots of journalists pushing it, making statements that are not true, but they get this stuff off intelligence agencies, and intelligence these days, and ever since or before the Iraqi war, is propaganda, and it's spread by the Americans with absolutely no worry about even thinking of whether it's accurate or not. One of their key agents in the weapons of mass destruction was a guy called Curveball, who no one in the CIA had ever met. He just made up this rubbish to try and keep giving refugee status in Germany, and he thought he was a minor criminal. He'd been in jail in Iraq. Not everyone who was in jail in Iraq was a political prisoner, and he didn't want to go back there. So he thought this would do the trick, and it did. And so I think people like Pompeo there, and as Secretary of State until another couple of months, and then before that, head of the CIA, nothing should be believed from the CIA. A very good example is even before that, and that is when both two separate secretaries of state went to the UN and said, look, the Soviet Union is dropping chemical weapons on Cambodia and Laos, etc. And they called it Yellow Rain. Well, it was. There was an scientist working for the DIO. Back then it was not called that, it was similar. It was DIO, Defence Intelligence Agency here. They got it spot on. It was caused by bees who'd been eating a lot of nectar, defecating en masse. And when they put this out, the CIA went berserk. There was 100 people working in this on CIA. Head of it, they all came out here to scream at this guy. And then what happened was that the ambassador approached Malcolm Fraser at a Christmas party and said, we want you to sack this guy. And Malcolm said, I have complete confidence in my scientists working for that organisation. I can think of certain prime ministers, one of them Labor, who would have sacked the scientist on the spot.
Good. Well, time has run out. So thank you, Brian, for this wonderful excursion around this world. And thank you all for coming and asking good questions. So with that, we'll pack up, and Brian's book is available out at the front stall.